everybody, and welcome to this second day. I want to thank Graham and Cosette for being kind enough to invite me to this shindig, and I'm very happy to be a part of it and to talk about things that I know all of you are interested in, because here it is in August, and you're going to a teaching conference, so that's pretty impressive right out of the gate. But what I'd like to talk about today is not the how to teach part of teaching and learning, but the how we learn part. And I say we in the sense that all of us on this call, just like all of our students, are learners. We're learning all the time, sometimes inadvertently, sometimes purposefully. And sometimes we're learning things that are very productive and positive, and sometimes we're not. We're learning other things that are unproductive and not so positive. But one of the things that's interesting to me about studying human behavior and student and human learning is how much of what we experience in a given day that we forget entirely. Right now, the current prevailing wisdom in psychology is that what we think of as the psychological present, when we say now, is usually a window of about 3 seconds in duration. Now, if you concatenated all those 3 seconds, which is, of course, it's a rolling 3 seconds. But if you did, in a typical waking day, if you get 8 hours sleep, that's 20,000 nows in a typical waking day, most of which are entirely forgotten. And that's not a bug in human memory. That's a feature. There would be no advantage to our recording and remembering all of the details of what we experience every day. So the question that I think all learners ask themselves, or should ask themselves, is what is it that tells my brain this is something I should hold on to? This is something I should retain and work into my lasting memory store, because it will some way be advantageous in the future. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to start by looking at a very short video of a little baby who's just so dear and lovely. Now, if you're not touched by that, you have no soul. I probably watched that thing 100 times. I never get tired of looking at this thing. That's how people learn, by that experience right there. Now, I just ask you to imagine for a moment if we were to make a lesson out of what that kid was just doing and what the lesson would look like. We'd have some descriptions about bowls and different materials that bowls could be made out of, and we'd have a quiz to make sure people can talk about the materials bowls are made of, and then we'd take this measuring cup and do the same thing, and then maybe show them how to hold it on the handle right here, and you whack it like this. And that's not the way we're built to learn. Certainly, we're capable as human beings from learning from other people, even by observing other people and imitating what other people do. In fact, that's one of the great features of not only us, but other primates as well. But the thing that's interesting about that is that's just the getting ready part. The watching part gets your brain ready to learn, but it's the doing part that actually instantiates the memory. And what happens a lot, and what we've done as institutions, because when you're teaching a lot of people all at the same time, it's understandable that people would say, well, let's systematize all of this. Let's neaten it up and set up a sequence of activities to get from wherever we're starting to whatever we want to be, with as many people behaving correctly at all points along the path as possible. And that's what happens when little kids go to school, right? I mean, there's this messy experience that kids have like this. And then in school, things change, and we start to systematize things in a way that I hope by the end of the hour today, I'll convince you is in many ways disadvantageous if it supplants experiences like the experience that you just saw. When I first started teaching, my first contractual teaching job, I was a band and orchestra director in Atlanta, Georgia. And it was a wonderful job. I loved it. And in my first year of teaching, I found out that the elementary school that was adjacent to my high school campus didn't have enough hours of music teacher time for the kindergartners and first graders to have music lessons. So being young and enthusiastic and stupid, I said, well, hell, I got a planning period. What am I going to do with that? So I volunteered to go 2 days a week to the elementary school, one hour each of those days, and teach music lessons to kindergartners and first graders. And I usually would have my, pardon my cuckoo clock cuckooing here. I would usually have stuff on a cart because the music teacher had the regular music room, the full-time music teacher. So I had a cart with some instruments on it and a record player. I don't know if you remember, records are like CDs, but really big, and some rhythm instruments and a guitar. And I'd wheel this cart into a elementary classroom, a kindergarten, first grade classroom. The kids would just be so excited to see me. Oh my God, it's music. What do you want to do? And I said, well, what do you want to do? You want to sing? Yeah, we'll sing. You know, you want to listen to a record? Yeah, Beethoven. Yeah, he's good. They were uninhibitedly, enthusiastically positive about anything I wanted to say that we're going to do. And if I would offer them a task, I would say, someone raise your hand and tell me what everybody's hand would go up. They didn't know what I was going to ask. I don't care. Pick me. I'll try. Now, those kids, when I met them when they were 5 and 6 years old, have now grown up, and they've become my stressed, sometimes depressed, grade anxious graduate students. And now when I pose a question, rather than everybody jumping up and raising their hands, I can't wait to answer this, everybody sort of looks at the table and says, God, don't call on me. Now, what happened to them? What happened to these bright, open, with it, pick me, I'll try, I don't know what's going on, but I don't care, and turned them into that? And the only common variable I can think ran through all their past experiences, they all went to school. And school very effectively, completely inadvertently, unintentionally, but very systematically created that kind of attitude about learning, which I'll talk more about in just a second. So to illustrate this point, I'm going to show you another video. This was about a 23-year-old video now that was from a larger movie called Minds of Our Own. Some of you may have seen this before. And this little clip I'm going to show you, which is about maybe a minute and 45 seconds, was filmed at the graduation ceremonies of Harvard University and Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And the students are milling around, and some of them are going to be asked to do a very simple operation involving electricity. And I'm just going to play this video and let you watch how they do.
Do you think you could light a bulb with a battery and wire? Do you think you could light a bulb with a battery and wire?
Yeah. Light a bulb with a battery and a wire. Maybe. Yes.
All right.
Definitely.
Do you think you can light a bulb with a battery and a wire?
Battery and wire? Well, yes, why not?
Okay.
Definitely.
Okay, can you do that?
The interesting part about the batteries and bulbs question is that people always predict that they can do it. Students say, of course I can do this.
Any hints I should have here?
Teachers say, of course my students can do this.
Ow! Do you know why that didn't work?
I have no idea.
Battery could be dead, the bulb could be bad, I'm hooking it up totally incorrectly. I'm not an electrical engineer, I'm a mechanical engineer. But if I had to guess, I would say it's operator error.
Okay.
I know it's possible, but I don't know how to do it.
It's only after failing that you begin to get upset with the question and think, well, maybe it's a trick question, maybe this has something to do with manipulating the wires, they couldn't hold all the wires together.
You don't have a current if you only have one wire. You need to complete a closed circuit.
But that's not the case.
Oh, well, if I do it with a little light bulb, I just do this. In which case the light just lights up.
It goes to the fundamental understanding of electricity. If one cannot light a light bulb with a battery and wire, then everything built upon those basic ideas has problems.
Now, I have to say, they didn't look for the 6 dullest looking students to ask this question. In fact, they asked many more students questions like this, many more graduates questions like this. And not only about the battery and the flashlight bulb, I mean, they also ask people, why are there seasons on the earth, and to explain how that happens and those kind of things. And the proportion of students in this video who answered correctly is equivalent to the proportion in the larger population who could answer the questions correctly, which is most people couldn't. Now, I got to tell you, I'm confident everybody in that video could calculate fluctuating voltages in a circuit using integral calculus to many significant digits. But you give them a D-cell battery and a piece of wire and a flashlight bulb and say, did we go over this? Right? Now, that's a huge thing to contemplate as a teacher, because I would predict that most of those students' teachers would have predicted that they understood how electricity worked in circuits, that they could solve that problem. And yet they didn't. And one of the things that I think is important for us to think about is, what are the indicators that we should rely on that tell us whether students have really understood what we think we've taught them? Because I want to suggest to you that many of the things that we do when we teach people to do various things is that we teach them how to get the right answer. But here's my revelation for the hour. Getting the right answer is a poor indicator of understanding. It's just the right answer. And I'll show you what I mean by that in the next couple of minutes. I'm very fond of the philosopher Daniel Dennett, who's at Tufts University in Boston. And he uses this phrase a lot that I co-opted for my own purposes here, that competence does not equal comprehension. That it's possible to do things and do them correctly without really understanding what it is that you're doing. Now, you might ask, well, what's the consequence of that? So what? If you're doing it correctly, what's the problem? Why are you bugging me about this? Well, there are two things about that. First of all, the memory is less likely to persist over time if you don't really understand what you're doing. And what's even more detrimental is that the likelihood of your being able to generalize this to situations other than the situations you've been explicitly taught is close to zero. So that's a big deal. And if there's any slide, any set of words that I'd like you to remember from my talk today, it's that following instructions doesn't necessarily lead to understanding. It might just lead to the right answer. And knowing the right answer is a poor indicator of understanding. It's just the right answer. But unfortunately, many of our students believe that the right answer is the sine qua non of what's going on, because that's what I get points for. That's what I get credit for. That's how I get a good grade in this class. So what's this comprehension stuff that you're talking about? It's a whole different task. So we're all very fortunate to have this 3 pounds of goo in our heads. This is the most complicated machine in the known universe. Current thinking is there are about 86 billion, that's billion with a B, neurons in a typical human brain. And that doesn't count the equal or larger number of support cells and structural cells like astrocytes and glia and other things that help all those neurons go. And those 86 billion neurons make up to 100 trillion connections with each other. This is just like unimaginably large numbers. We can't even fathom what those numbers mean. But you think, man, that's a lot of circuitry in there. And what's going on in that circuitry? I mean, what is it that's taking place with all that stuff that's in a brain? And I'd like you to consider two things that brains do really well that allow us to function in almost all ways as human beings. The one thing they do is brains look for patterns in environmental stimuli. And we're so good at finding patterns, we even see patterns where there aren't really patterns. You know, we look at a big puffy cloud in the sky and we think, oh my God, it's an antelope. Well, no, it's water vapor, but it kind of looks like an antelope. And so what your brain does, if it has a memory of the shape and appearance of an antelope in your head, that shape then triggers that memory. And then now you're called to think of this animal and the name for this animal and maybe even where you saw this animal in your past and those kind of things. So that pattern recognition, that searching for pattern is what our brains are doing all the time, because knowing patterns allows us to make predictions about what's going to happen next. And the whole reason to have a brain, I mean, there are a lot of good benefits of having a brain, but why would evolution develop something like this that only takes up about 3% of our body weight, but uses about 20% of our daily caloric intake of energy? It's really expensive to run a brain. And that's not even when you're thinking hard. That's just keeping the lights on. It costs a lot to run a brain. So why would evolution select for that? And here's the answer. Because being able to predict what's about to happen helps you better navigate the world around you, right? If I'm a better predictor, I will be better able at catching prey. I will be better able at avoiding becoming prey. I will be better able to attract a mate. Whatever the thing happens to be, if I'm better at predicting, I'm usually going to be better at what I'm doing and actually be more confident in what I'm doing. And all of us who have taught for a long time know that one of the things that happens as you become a more and more experienced teacher is you become a better predictor about what students are going to do, where they might misunderstand, when they might lose attention, those kinds of things, because our experiences that become stored in our memory are now being cued by things that are in our visual field and our perceptual field, our auditory field, that allow us to now make predictions, not always completely accurate, but sort of in the ballpark, that we wouldn't have done if we hadn't had those experiences. And the second thing that brains do is they form associations based on temporal proximity. So we tend to pair things together if they happen close together in time. And so if there are things in the environment that sort of co-occur, or one typically precedes the other one, then then seeing one or hearing one or feeling one will call up an expectation that the other one will be around the corner soon. Same thing, things in my head. If things are now become associated in my head, calling up one of those things will elicit a recall of the other one. Seeing a thing in the environment, something in my head. So these connections are happening all the time based on our experiences. So all that hardware, all those 86 billion neurons and all those support cells, that's the gig, those two tasks. It's really a remarkable thing when you think about it, how much can be accomplished with just that. But of course, our brains aren't just taking a movie of what's going on, which is one of the reasons that we don't remember most of what we're saying. In order for the things that are coming into our stimulus field, the things that are lights falling on our retina and the sound waves that are pushing our tympanic membrane and our inner ear around, all those kinds of things, our tactile senses, that has to be encoded in some way so it can be stored and manipulated in this electrochemical goo that is a brain. So it's not just a high fidelity recording of our experiences, right? That stuff has to be changed in some way. Now, the consequence of that is that everybody who's in a room together is not having exactly the same experience, right? Because what's in your brain already is going to influence how the stuff that you're experiencing is going to be encoded, right? And how it's stored and how retrievable it will be in the future, right? Now, of course, the storage part's an important part too, but I realize with my advancing age, I think there may be a leak in my storage container because some stuff that used to be in there, I can't seem to find it anymore. But the big deal is, can I retrieve what's in my memory advantageously in the future? Because anything that's in there is not valuable unless I can retrieve it advantageously in the future. So the question I think that we ought to be asking ourselves as teachers, what are the occasions? What are the scenarios within which learners will be advantaged by being able to retrieve memory? And are we practicing and having them practice, not just getting the information or the skill in, but getting it out, right? Are we practicing by creating experiences that are opportunities for learners to recall the things that are in their heads in a way that allows them to function effectively? So I'm going to show you some of these little neurons. Picture these things. So this is a micrograph of a singular neuron, and you can see this big long process here is the axon, which is the downstream messaging going to the next neurons that it's connected to. All these dendrites are all the connections to upstream neurons that are sending signals to this neuron. And I'm going to magnify that a little bit. And you can see all these little nubs on here if your screen is large enough. Each one of those things represents a connection to an upstream neuron that's sending signals to this neuron. It's tremendously complicated. It's just amazing. But again, it's only doing two things, right? Looking for patterns and forming associations based on temporal proximity. As I keep going on with this, I just want to show you a movie. It's about a minute and a half, but it's worth it because it's so cool. Much of what we understand about how brains work, we've learned from brains that don't work. And I'm going to show you a brief movie that was taken during a brain surgery on a patient with epilepsy. I mean, much of what we've learned about brains, we've been able to learn when we have to open someone's skull to actually operate on their brain, whether it's a removal of a tumor or something like that. But often when we're trying to cure intractable epilepsy that's not amenable to medication, we have to go into the brain and actually do things to excise different parts of the brain. So this patient, let me explain what's happening. This patient is lying on a table on his side. Part of his skull is open. He's watching a video monitor that's showing different images. And while he's watching these images, an electrode is recording the activity of a single neuron in his entorhinal cortex. So what you're going to see, that these little clicks you hear and the little blips you see are the firing of this neuron while this person is watching this video of these different images. And it will show you what the images are on the screen, but in words. And then they're going to turn the video off. They're going to ask the guy lying on the table to just recall the stuff that he saw in the video, and you will hear him. His voice has been manipulated to protect his privacy, but you will hear him recall things and see that same neuron firing. So anyway, here we go. This is way cool here. Each one of those clicks is a nerve impulse down the axon of a neuron. Okay, now we're skipping ahead. They've turned the video off. They're going to ask him to verbally recall what he just. Okay, now I have to say that all that is The Simpsons is not encoded in that one neuron, right? There are lots of things about The Simpsons, right? There's Lisa's saxophone and the sound of Marge's voice and the color of Homer's shirt and all these kinds of things, right? And those are encoded in a constellation of neurons in all of our heads who are Simpson watchers and Simpson fans, right? But what this is illustrating is that one neuron just has one thing associated with it, and that's firing in response to The Simpsons. Now, why is that consequential? Well, it's consequential in thinking about how did that happen, right? Because the neuron wasn't, I mean, you weren't born with a Simpson neuron in your head. So how did that happen? Well, in order for that neuron to fire in response to The Simpsons, your brain had to restructure itself, right? The physical structure of the brain had to change. And that's biologically expensive. And brains are inherently efficient. And another word for efficient is lazy. So they don't expend any energy they don't think they need to spend, right? So again, what would motivate a brain to expend the biological energy to actually modify its structure to form a memory? And like I said, this is an important thing to think about as a teacher, because we often, not just as teachers, but our students too, use metaphors for organic brains like ours that are not anything like organic brains. Like it's interesting too, when you look at the history of human thought, whatever the prevailing technology was at the time, that's what people use as a metaphor for how brains work. So in the end of the 19th century, steam power was the thing, and there was actually a hydraulic theory of brains because they knew that there was fluid inside neurons, and they thought that fluid was being pumped around the brain. That's how your brain worked. And then beginning of the 20th century, when people invented wire recorders and then tape recorders, then that was thought to be the way memory worked. And now we have computer memory, and people think, well, that's the way brains work. But let me just say, when you're working at your computer and you decide you want to save something, you hit the save command. What your computer does, it looks for a blank space on the drive, or a space on the drive that's not being used for something that you have said you want saved. It writes what you saved to that. And by writes, I mean a bunch of binary switches flip from 1 to 0, 0 to 1 in some configuration that represents what you saved. Your computer puts an address on it. And barring some malfunction or some physical catastrophe with your computer, later that day, later that week, a year from now, again, barring some physical catastrophe or malfunction, you can click on the icon for that thing. Your computer will go find the address on the drive. It'll read off what's there. And what it reads off will be just the way it was when you put it there. What was on the drive before you saved that thing has no effect, barring a malfunction, on what you saved. What you put on the drive after having saved that thing will have no effect on what you saved. And I take the time to say all that because the organic brains don't work anything like that. All of you who's watching this video right now, or watching this session right now, you're having a different experience than people also on this who are watching this video, not only because you have a different computer and you're in a different room, or even if we're all in the same room, all of you will be having a different experience because all of you have a different set of memories in your head that you brought to this experience. And what all of your brains are doing right now is all those memories are being elicited in various ways by the things that you're experiencing right now. And your brain's trying to figure out, what does this stuff have to do with what's already in there, right? That's what's happening to everybody. So when we say, well, all the students had the same experience, well, not quite. Right? Because they didn't come in the room the same. They have different experiences in their memories already. So what they experience personally is going to be different from the people sitting around, the people sitting next to them. It's a huge thing to think about when you're imagining what you're doing as a teacher. I'm going to show a little video that our university used to play when our football team and basketball team would play on national television. You know, American universities, I don't know if you do this with hockey in Canada or whatever, but when our teams are on, national programs, we have little video snippets that are like 10 or 15 seconds long that tout how cool our university is. So this is one that we used to play at Texas about 23 years ago, but I've been on this faculty a long time, but I thought that was so cool and so expressed the attitude of Texas, the audacity of it, that I'm going to go ahead and play this and I'll talk about it after it's over.
We don't claim to be able to change the world. We just change people. And then they change the world. We're Texas.
Right? I mean, come on. Who doesn't want to school there? Who doesn't want to go to school there? Except now with COVID, no one wants to come to school here. But I think, the audacity of that we just change people. We bring them here and we change them. And then they go change the world. And when that was playing in the late 90s, and I would be at some social gathering with the then president and then provost, and I would say, that video we're playing now, it says we just change people. How do we know that? And how do we know we're changing them the way we're intending to change them? And the true answer is, well, we really don't have any idea. I mean, we bring them into rooms, we have them do stuff, we show them stuff, we tell them stuff, then we have them tell us what we told them and show us what we showed them. And after a few years of that, we give them a degree, they walk out the door. But I'm not sure, because changing people is a lot more effortful than that. It takes a lot more than that. And here's what I want to talk about this change process and what we need to do to make this work. Now, this will be a review for almost everyone on this call, because I'm sure all of you have had a beginning psychology course at some time and learned about reinforcement and how reinforcement teaches responses to various stimuli. So I'm going to show you a study that was done in the early 2000s with macaque monkeys, which are often a subject in studies like this, where they're studying how the brains function in terms of the release of dopamine. And many of you have also heard of the neurotransmitter dopamine, which is one of many neurotransmitters, and it has a great deal to do with our sense of reward. So when we as human beings experience a feeling of pleasure, whether it's we just had a good meal or we saw something happily surprising or whatever, that feeling is initiated by a release of neurotransmitter dopamine from cells deep in our brain. So here's the quick review of classical conditioning, right? So there are some stimuli in our environment that we don't have to learn to respond to. We respond to them innately, right? So when we think about foods that are tasty, or being in a safe environment that feels safe and cozy, I mean, all those kinds of things we don't have to learn to feel good about. We generally do without any learning. So in this particular experiment, there was this sweet sugary water that was dispensed to these monkeys who were sitting in this little contraption. And if you let's think time going left to right across the x-axis there. So reward comes when that little bar goes up there and the monkey gets happy. But actually, that's not the monkey's smile. I pasted that smile on there. Forgive me. And I think the monkey will forgive me too. But let's look at what happens to the dopamine neurons, the neurons that produce dopamine when this happens over time. So if we run that again, right, you'll see that when the reward comes, there's a spike in the firing of those neurons. And this is like all the neurons that they're measuring right there. And you can see that spike here when the dopamine is released because the reward is present. Okay, so everybody gets that. That's pretty straightforward. But again, remember from classical conditioning, we also have a conditioned stimulus, which on its own doesn't elicit any kind of response from the organism at all. It has to learn to respond to that conditioned stimulus. So what do? We're going to compare this conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. So now, let's say this conditioned stimulus, which it was in this particular experiment, was a picture that was on a computer screen, and the picture comes on for a few seconds. When the picture goes off, the reward happens. So if that happens over a number of trials, the monkeys start to learn, well, when I see that picture, it means that the reward is going to be coming any moment. Now, I'd like to look at now what happens to the dopamine release in that scenario. So now I want you to look at where the spike is. The spike no longer comes when the reward comes. The spike comes when the picture appears, which is the predictor of the reward. This is how we learn to do things that matter, right? If it didn't work like this, we could not function as organisms. And most organisms with brains could not function, because what we have to know is that the predictor of a genuine reward has to have value because it will lead us to pursue the reward, right? And I will talk about this as it relates to teaching in just a second. So again, you look at the spikes of those individual neurons, and you see now the spike isn't here when the sweet, sugary stuff comes. It's when the picture shows up that predicts, the sweet, sugary stuff. Now, here's what's not expected about this. I mean, we've understood this like forever. I mean, Pavlov, a long time ago. But here's something really fascinating. What if we show another picture, and instead of that picture always preceding the dispensation of the reward, always preceding that, what if we had a picture that half the time when that picture shows up, the reward comes, and half the time it doesn't? But it's on a random schedule. So you have no way of knowing when you see that picture whether you're going to get a reward or not. Now I want to show you what happens to the dopamine, and look at what the thing looks like now. So there's a 50% chance now that you'll get the little sweet sugary stuff when things happen. And now I'd like you to show what happens here, right? Here's the spike when you see the picture, but there's a steady increase of dopamine. I'm just kind of lumping together a bunch of things here. And what this shows is the maximum amount of dopamine occurs when there's the least certainty of reward. Now, that sounds kind of paradoxical, doesn't it? But I think any of us who have tried to solve a problem and we didn't quite know how to do it, but we worked at it and we did it on our own and we got it, found that reward signal was much stronger if somebody merely taught us an algorithm that we then applied and got us to the right answer. And I'll show you an example about this, about school. I'm going to ask all of you to solve for X in this problem. Just take your time, solve for X. And so I know you don't have a chat or anything, but let me just say what happens often if I'm in a room full of people and I ask people to solve for X. I say, someone raise your hand and tell me what the answer is, especially when I'm with faculty. Almost nobody raises their hand. In fact, I gave a talk where I used this slide several years ago at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and Tom Cech, who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry, and I think 1988 was there. And he didn't raise his hand. And I saw him at the little wine and cheese reception after my talk. I said, why did you raise your hand? He said, I'm not going to raise my hand. I said, you're Tom Cech. You won the Nobel Prize. I think your reputation is safe. But what's happened is, right, if you're not absolutely certain what the answer is, why would you raise your hand? Why would you volunteer an answer? It just seems like a crazy thing to do. Okay, so many people, when I ask, guess correctly that the answer is 3/2 or 1.5. I do that. Then the next question I ask is, someone raise your hand and tell me how you got that. How did you get from this to 1.5? And now very few hands go up. Not because people, just are afraid to answer. Is that no one ever explained that to me, or if they did, it certainly didn't become a lasting part of my memory, right? But when I say how you got it, most people do this, which is the universal gesture for this problem, which means you flip that thing over. That's called the divisor, by the way, in this equation, and you multiply across. You get 6/4. You reduce a fraction, you get 1.5. But now I ask the question: why do you invert the divisor? I mean, why do you do that? And very few people actually know why they do that. The best response I ever got, I was in a room full of fifth graders once, and I said, why do you invert the divisor in a fraction? And some kid raised his hand and said, because if you don't get it wrong, what better rationale do I need to answer a question than that? But I want to suggest to you that the rationale for inverting the divisor is the only thing that makes that problem interesting. But if the goal of a teacher or an institution or a society is to get rooms full of disparate learners all getting the correct answer for that equation, then one way to do that is print out papers with a lot of equations look just like that with different numbers in them and teach everybody to go invert and multiply, invert and multiply, invert and multiply. And you'll get everybody getting the right answer with no commensurate requirement that anybody understands what the hell we're doing. Because you don't have to. You can be competent, but you don't have to comprehend. Now, again, this is a consequential thing when we think about the things that we teach, because it asks us the question, what should be the measure of comprehension? Because it's not the same measure as competence, right? Comprehension requires a different kind of assessment. This is the kind of assessment that usually happens. I brought some data. This is a typical learning curve of an undergraduate student at the University of Texas at Austin. This is data from freshmen. And so the semester one time is running across the x-axis here. The amount learned is up on the y-axis. And that's generally what happens. And as you can see, there's midterm exams, there's final exams. And this little dip here, there's a street with a lot of bars down called 6th Street in Austin. That's where people go and they kind of lose a little bit of what they had after that. But there's a lot wrong with that curve. But this is what a lot of students' school experiences are like. Relative periods of inactivity punctuated by shorter intervals of panic. Now, how do we contribute to that? Well, we're banking on people actually doing stuff during these relative periods of inactivity in terms of their formal assessments, when in fact, many students don't. So right now, the model in much of higher education, actually it's becoming more so in primary and secondary education in the United States, is that there are few assessments that are really high in magnitude, but low in frequency. And what I'm suggesting to you today is that needs to flip, right? What we need are much more frequent opportunities for students to show what they know, not any one of which matters that much. And I'll say more about that in just a couple of seconds here. This is kind of an interesting thing about watching other people and what we learn from watching other people and how that actually screws up our own thinking about how we learn ourselves. So this recent study in psychological science, people were invited to watch demonstrations of expert dart throwers throwing darts. So these two gray bars here are so-called low exposure and high exposures. This had to do with how many times they got to watch the expert dart thrower throw the dart. And in these first two bars, people were asked to predict how well they think they would be able to throw the darts after having watched this. And you can see from this, the more they watched, the better they thought they would be. Now, they haven't thrown a dart yet, but yet just by watching somebody else be competent, they're starting to overestimate their own competence. And these are when they actually threw the darts. And you can see they weren't very good at all compared to what their estimates were. And, often I will give a lecture to a class and I don't use notes, and sometimes I don't have a PowerPoint, and I'll talk for an hour, and a student will come up to me and say, Dr. Duke, how do you remember all that stuff? I can't, how do you do it? I couldn't possibly remember all that stuff. And my response to them is, you're absolutely right. You couldn't possibly remember all that stuff, but it has nothing to do with the inherent limitations of your memory. The reason I can remember all that stuff and you can't yet is because my memories are organized entirely differently than yours. And here's the thing. The organization of memories happens inside the head of the learner. You can't plant it in there. And the only way that organization happens, the only way the things that people know and the things that are able to do and the emotions related to those things become advantageously interconnected is by the learner doing stuff. And here's the kicker, the learner doing stuff that leads to mistake making. Now, notice I choose my words very carefully. I didn't say that lead to failure. I said lead to mistake making. There's a lot of things like, you need to fail. It's so dramatic. Let's just get rid of that word and talk about what it is. Mistake making. All of us on this call, we make mistakes all the time. We make countless mistakes, even professionally. If I write a grant that doesn't get funded, the university doesn't dock my salary. I just write a better grant. And if I send an article to a journal for publication and the miscreants on the editorial committee think I need to change my paper, somebody doesn't say, well, we're going to lower your rank back to associate professor. I change the paper, and often I have to admit it's often better, damn it. But anyway, so we have a way of dealing with mistake making that we don't often afford students, which is a huge hole in the experiences that we're providing for them. I'll just show you one other thing. This is with mirror tracing, where you're looking at your hand in a mirror. You can't see your hand is covered, and you're tracing a shape with your hand. And again, the more people watch, the better they think they're at it, even though they haven't actually done it yet. And then one more I have to show you, which is just kind of cool. They had people watch people do a moonwalk, which is a dance move for those of you who are uninitiated. And again, the more they watched, the better they thought they would be, even though they hadn't taken a step yet. Now I'm going to give you a puzzle to do that is contrasting to the puzzle to the problem that I just showed you about dividing by a fraction. And I'd like you to work on it on your own silently for about a minute and not Google it. Okay, so here's the puzzle. So I have 9 2-inch cubes that are identical in every way. They feel the same, they look the same, they're sealed. You can't get inside of them. But inside one of those 9 cubes is a $100 bill wadded up inside. And inside the other 8 cubes are wadded up pieces of paper the size of a $100 bill, but they're just blank pieces of paper. They're not worth anything. And your challenge and your incentive is if you can find the cube with the $100 bill, you get to keep the $100 bill, hypothetically. Now you say, Bob, how am I going to find the $100 bill? The cubes are sealed, the paper's wadded up inside. How am I going to find it? Well, here's a hint. The paper that the $100 bill is printed on is just a little bit heavier than the blank paper. But the difference is so slight, your motor system can't detect it. So if I had a $100 bill paper in this hand, blank piece of paper cube in this hand, I couldn't tell the difference by feel. So to help you solve the problem, I'm going to give you this balance scale. And balance scales don't have any numbers on them. It just tells you which side of the scale has more mass on it. And I'm going to let you use this scale to weigh the cubes and find out where the $100 bill is. But here's what makes it a puzzle, right? You can only use the scale 2 times. So you can put some stuff on the scale and see what happens. You can put some stuff on the scale and see what happens. And that's it, no more scale. Now, that's the scenario. I'm going to give you, like I said, a full minute to think about that while I sit quietly. And what I'd like you to do, again, don't try to find the answer somewhere else. See if you can figure it out. Some people are helped by drawing and those kind of things. I can say, none of you have your cameras on, but usually when I do this with live people or people with their cameras on, and I'm looking at people's faces while I'm explaining the problem, some people have a look on their face like, well, I can solve that. And other people look at me and say, gee, I don't think I can solve that. And other people look like, this is stupid. I'm not going to solve it. So every class is represented whenever I do this. But so I'm going to give you a minute. Go ahead and start working on this. And after a minute, I'll call us all back and we'll talk about what you just did. Okay. Okay. It's been about a minute. Now, if you earnestly tried to solve that and you didn't solve it, you really want me to tell you what the answer is. And if you tried to solve it and you solved it, you really want to tell somebody else who hasn't solved it yet what the answer is. And if you already knew this problem, you too want to tell somebody what the answer is. And I'm going to give you some advice about increasing the joy in your life. Don't do any one of those things. If you haven't solved this yet, just wait. Think about it later today. See what happens, And if you did solve it, don't ruin it for somebody who hasn't solved it yet. Let them puzzle over it and see if they can come up with a solution. Now, I would tell you, this kind of problem illustrates vividly the kind of impatience that we cultivate in school. Many people, when I tell them I'm not going to tell them the answer, are very frustrated by the fact I'm not going to tell them the answer. I mean, after investing a minute, really? That's it? And now you can't stand it? You want the answer because you've invested a whole minute? What are we talking about? Again, that school does that, right? Anybody who's watched a kid who people say is impatient in school, who says he's impatient generally, and then watch that kid learn to play a video game, you don't see the same kind of impatience you see in school. Because what we teach in school is, after I explain this to you, you ought to get it, and you ought to get it pretty fast, right? And we don't accommodate the fact that not everybody's going to work at the same speed. Not everybody's going to come to understand at the same speed or come to execute the skill at the same speed. And we need to make accommodations for that when we're thinking about the things we're asking students to show us when we're teaching them whatever it is that we're teaching them. Now, I have to tell you about 5 summers ago, the Austin School District asked me to give a talk for all the new teachers who were hired by the district. So 1,000 new teachers in this room. And big auditorium, and I did this thing, and I showed this slide, and I'm starting to move on to the next slide. And this woman, who I later found out was an elementary teacher, raised her hand and said, well, what's the answer to the cube problem? I said, I'm not going to tell you. She was pissed. It's like, what do you mean? This is school. You give me a problem and I work on it for a while and then I give up and you explain it to me. Why is that? Why is that what school is like? I was giving a talk at the University of Glasgow several years ago, and I also showed this slide. I showed this slide a lot. And I was the first talk in the morning, and at the end of the day, at that little wine and cheese thing, these 4 graduate students came up to me, a male and 3 females. And the male says to me, so what's the answer to the cube problem? I said, I'm not going to tell you. He said, what? I haven't listened to a damn thing all day. I was just trying to solve this problem. What's the answer to the problem? I said, I'm not going to tell you, but I'll ask you questions about it. I'll say, so what if you just put 1 cube on each side? He said, well, that's stupid. There's still 7 cubes again. I said, don't go by the too fast. What could you learn just from that? And before I could ask him the next question, one of his friends, who I later learned her name was Gemma, which is a lovely Scottish name, Gemma goes, I got it. Now, I could not give her that. No lucid explanation from me would have done that for Gemma. But in order for Gemma to have that experience, both she and I needed to be patient and allow time to pass so she could actually work through whatever was going on in the problem and then come to a solution. Now, granted, in a lot of college classes, people say we got to cover a lot of stuff with the thought that if we cover a lot, students will learn more. And I want to suggest to you, there is no empirical evidence that that's the case. I often challenge people to give the final exam for a fall semester course when students come back from spring break and just see how much, not a different final exam, the same exam, and just see how much students can still do. And you'll have a sense of, why are we trying to jam so much stuff into so little time? And for the past, I don't know how many years, I've given the opening talk on teaching for the new faculty seminar here at Texas. And one of the things I say is, because a lot of people are, first-year teachers, and some of them coming from the institution and whatever. I say, I know you started working out your syllabi already. What I'd like you to advise you to do is take like 2/3 of the content of your syllabus and just get rid of it. And everybody's eyes get really big, and usually some nice assistant professor will come up to me after my talk and say, hey, you said get rid of 2/3. He said, well, listen, I'm teaching chemistry 101. And my department chair teaches 102. And when my students get to 102 and they don't know something, and my department chair says, who did you take 101 with? And it's me, well, then what? And what I assure my young friend is, what, no matter what you teach in 101, that's going to happen anyway. So free yourself from that burden of thinking that you've got to cover all this stuff and do less more, right? Do fewer things, but spend more time elaborating on the few things you do rather than just trying to jam a lot of stuff into people's heads. Error making is a huge deal. And if I were to ask you to memorize this list of word pairs here, and I just let you, look at this list for 5 minutes or something and said, later on, I'm going to show you the word on the left side and I want you to recall the word on the right side. And I would do this a day later or whatever, you would have a certain level of success at doing that. But what if I approach this problem differently? What if I said, I'm going to show you just the first word, and I'm going to ask you to guess what you think the second word is. Now, you think if you're guessing, if all I know is fish, and I got to guess what the other word is, it could be a lot of things. It could be lake, it could be fillet, it could be swim, it could be gills. It could be any number of things, right? Same thing with kitchen, highway, all those things. But if I had you guess first, and after you guessed, I showed you what the correct answer was, a day later, a week later, you would remember that list much better than if you saw both words together right from the get-go. Now that seems counterintuitive, right? It seems like, no, wait, but I'm guessing wrong. So how can it possibly help me to get the wrong answer? Well, here's the reason. This is a really interesting experiment that was published in 2015. So if I give a prompt like one of those words, I say flower, and guess what the other word is? Well, it could be, this is four of many, it could be daffodil or chrysanthemum or whatever, right? But if I ask people to do this and ask them to guess versus, showing them the answer right from the beginning, the correct answer is daffodil in this case. Here's the thing. And they did this with younger students, which were college age students, and older students, which is like guys like me. And you'll see the trial and error, the guessing first is the gray bar, is that like for the younger people, like 12, 15% better at remembering the correct answer. And even for us old people, like 10% better remember the correct answer when we guessed, even though most of our guesses were incorrect. But think about what this prompt is, right? You're not just guessing anything. When you hear the prompt flower, well, now my brain kicks into gear and all the flowers that I know are now activated in my brain, right? So my brain is starting to light up a lot of flower stuff before I find out what the right answer is. And to show that that's how it's working and not some other way, if I give a different prompt, like I say, there's a word, here's the first two letters of the word, and you fill out the rest of the word. And now it could be anything. It could be brick or brace or bruise or bracket. And then I test you later. By the way, the correct was that is bracket. There's no advantage to guessing at all because there's no relationship between the possibilities of the correct answer. Isn't that fascinating? I just find that like just so cool. Whenever I talk to medical students who, if they are in Canada like they are in the US, medical students have very much discipline themselves to be correct in school as undergraduates. And they get into med school and they bring that way of thinking with them. But one of the things that I encourage them to think about is when you're in a learning mode, that is, you're in a class or you're in a simulation or something like that, that's the time when mistake making is advantageous, right? And I want to say this word that I like a lot is muddle. I think giving people a chance to muddle, like you did through that 9-cube problem, I think is an important part of every experience that people have when they learn, right? Expecting mistakes to happen because you don't know what you're doing yet. So of course you're going to make mistakes. So you have multiple opportunities to do this, and those multiple opportunities allow you to self-correct. When you're in performance, when you're in the clinic and you're dealing with patients, well, then you want to avoid mistakes because there's less opportunity for error correction. There's not that there's no opportunity, but there's less opportunity. But this is a different mode than learning mode. And I found it quite advantageous to talk to medical students about thinking about what mode are you in now? Are you in learning mode or are you in performance mode? Now, it's not that you don't perform when you're in learning mode ever, because you do. We have exams to pass, the medical boards and those kind of things. And it's not like you don't learn when you're in performance mode, because you revisit things that happened. You have morbidity and mortality meetings and kind of like what went wrong with this patient, that kind of thing. But differentiating, what am I doing right now? Am I learning right now, or am I performing? Because if I'm learning, mistake making is to my advantage. If I'm performing, different kettle of fish. This is one of my favorite phrases that I ever made up. I consider myself, as a highly skillful teacher, I am a strategic confusion creator. So my task is to create experiences for learners in which they are strategically confused. And by strategic, I mean they are confusions that I'm pretty confident they have the time and capacity to work themselves out of. Now, different learners have different tolerances for confusion, right? Because different people, a lot of dissonance. I mean, being far away from the answer is very dispiriting to some learners. For others, they'll persist in something for a very long time. So again, this has to be calibrated at multiple levels of engagement, so people can say, okay, I'm going to tackle this problem, even though that's a little hard. So just a quick aside here. So whenever I do give written exams, all my exams have more questions on the exam than you need to answer to get a good grade. And the questions vary in terms of their difficulty. So like there'll be a group of 5 questions, you need to answer 3 of those 5, or there'll be a group of 4 questions, you need to answer 1 of those 4, something like that, right? Now, all my jaundiced colleagues say, well, I bet everybody just answers the easiest questions and calls it a day. I've never found that to be the case. Now, there are some students who answer all the easiest questions, and they demonstrate that they understand. Good. And there are some other students who choose, I bet I could answer that question. And they tackle a harder question than they even have to tackle, and they show me what they understand. Good. Now, think about how that's different from what typically happens, where we're asking everybody to do the same thing at the same time, right? And we have a few students who are thriving and doing great, and we have a bunch of students up in the middle, and we have a few students who are in the weeds, right? But what I'm concerned about are all the people who are not in the I'm thriving group. What are they starting to believe about themselves in terms of their capacity to understand this subject matter, right? Because if I'm in a class and we're supposed to be doing this on this day, and the quiz is on Friday, and I don't quite understand it yet by Friday, but I might understand it by next Tuesday, well, tough, because the quiz is Friday, and on next Tuesday, we're going to be on something totally different. Okay, so I won't spend too much more time on that. The people who understand what I'm talking about strategic confusion, are the authors of really good video games. Many of you, if you're iPhone video game fans or Android phone video games, will recognize that this is the scenario for a game called Angry Birds. I was for a long time addicted to this game when I used to get on airplanes a lot, which I used to before COVID. And I was so thrilled when the Federal Aviation Administration allowed us to keep our electronic devices out and on during takeoff and landing, because I'd sit on this plane and I'd grab my phone and I'd start hurling these little colored birds with a slingshot to kill pigs that have stolen the birds' eggs. Now, what's wrong with me? I mean, I'm a grown man. I have a house, I have a job, what the hell am I doing here? Well, what happened is the people who designed this game knew how to strategically confuse me and give me optimal challenges that I saw as surmountable in the near term. So I'm going to play you a little video that is the entire introduction to Angry Birds. This is going to show you how you play the game Angry Birds. Here's it. Here's all the instructions that you get when you open the game. Okay, something's bad's going to happen. It's a xylophone. It's in a minor key. Okay, here's how you play the game. That's it. Start playing. Now, wait a minute. Does it matter how far I pull back the slingshot? If I pull it back farther, will the bird go farther? I don't know. You just have to try and find out. Well, what if the pig is like behind a rock? And can I If I pull the slingshot down, can I lob it over the rock? You just have to try and find out. Now, of course, at the beginning of this game, you could cough on your phone and kill a pig, right? But strategically, as you play this game, the challenges become greater, right? So now there are two pigs, and one's behind a rock and one's not. And then later on, there's a pig that's behind a piece of wood, but the wood is tilting away from you. So you can't lob the bird. But now you get a new bird that goes through wood. And now you learn to use that bird. So over time, you become really good at this and you like it a lot, right? But again, these are very strategic kinds of challenges. When I drive around Austin, I often see kids on bicycles like this with training wheels. And as often as not, the training wheels are set incorrectly. So this girl on the left here, she's never going to learn how to balance on her bicycle with that bicycle because the training wheel, both training wheels and the back wheel of the bike are all touching the ground at the same time. She might learn about pedaling and steering. They can learn nothing about balancing because no matter what she does, the shift her center of gravity, the bicycle is going to stay perfectly upright because all three wheels are on the ground. Right? Now, this kid here, I don't know if it's a male or female, is on this bike, and this training wheel, maybe because you can't see in the picture, is about 4 inches off the ground. So now, as this kid shifts his focus of his center of gravity on one side or the other, when he makes a balance error, the bicycle will respond to the balance error, but the training wheels will keep him from making a catastrophic balance error, right? So as he moves from one side to the other, the bike will move, but the training wheel will keep him from completely falling over. This is an optimal learning experience. This isn't. And why is it? And this is a big deal because there's opportunity for mistake making. And if there's no opportunity for mistake making, it's unlikely that people are going to learn effectively. But I'll show you the most effective way to get kids on a bicycle, and it's this. So what do you notice about that bicycle? I'll give you just a second to look at it. Those of you with little kids will recognize this right away. Other than that, the streamers are awesome. But what do you notice about that bike? Yeah, there are no pedals, right? This is called a stride bike or a strider bike. And now, in this bike, the training wheels are this girl's feet. And she already knows how to walk and balance on her feet. She knows how to run and balance on her feet. So we're going to ask her to take those skills that she already knows, and now we're going to use them while she's sitting on a bicycle seat and holding on to handlebars. So now not only are there ways to stop a catastrophic error because her feet are touching the ground or all close to the ground, but now we're exploiting all of the previous learning that she has. This is an entirely optimal learning environment for this kid, right? And I'll show you a little video. It's about, 10 seconds long that a former student of mine sent to me whose daughter just transitioned from a strider bike. And this was the first time she got on a pedal bike. Because again, you put kids on this bike and a typical kid, like in, 15, 18 minutes, gets to go fast enough that they kind of pick up their feet and they glide for a few feet. I mean, it's just, it's a lovely thing how effective that is. But anyway, here's my former student's kid on this bike. Look at that. First time on a pedal bike. Okay, so I started and ended with kids. And I'll thank everybody for being at least as attentive as your pictures seem to indicate you are. And let me thank Graham and Tommy and Cosette and everybody at the Center for Teaching and Learning for having me here.